What's happening, everybody? On today's show, more driving-related arrests at Georgia. Kirby, what in the world is going on? Locked On SEC starts right now.
You are Locked On SEC, your daily podcast on the Southeastern Conference. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And what is happening, everybody? Welcome into Locked On SEC. It's great to have you guys along on today's show. We're going to talk with Colby Newton. He's got a new SEC book out just ahead of the start of the season. We got news and tidbits all around the conference, including a few new arrests over at Georgia. I'm Chris Gordy. Thanks for making Locked On SEC your first listen every day. Shout out to our everydayers. Keep coming back and checking us out each and every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, covering your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more as the playoffs have winded down and we're getting into the summer months. FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com today to get started. We got plenty to jump into, so let's dive into it. Let's go around the conference.
Boots out to the right. Takes the handoff. What a catch!
Around the conference.
Yeah, we start over at Georgia as a couple of Georgia football players making headlines as several outlets reporting on Thursday. Two Bulldog players were arrested on reckless driving charges. Linebacker Smael Mondon and offensive lineman Bo Hughley facing the charges from separate incidents. Now, according to Anthony Dasher of Rivals, Athens-Clarke County Police, their records show Mondon was arrested on Wednesday night at 11:05 on misdemeanor charges of racing on highway streets and reckless driving. He was released at midnight on bond. Hughley was arrested at 8:37 Tuesday night on charges of reckless driving and failure to maintain proper lane usage. He was arrested as a result of an investigation pertaining to a single car accident there in Athens. He was released on bond later that night at 10 p.m. Thursday's news of the arrests come after prominent transfer running back Trevor Etienne accepted a plea deal in which DUI charges were dismissed after pleading no contest to a reckless driving charge from a couple of months ago. Reckless driving is a misdemeanor charge in the state of Georgia. Now, according to 24/7 Sports, Georgia is now at 4 offseason arrests following Etienne and wide receiver Jacoby White, who was arrested on reckless driving back in May. Last year, you had Jamin Dumas-Johnson, Jalen Carter, Marcus Rosemy-Jackson, the Nylon Morissette, all faced driving-related arrests. And, of course, tragically, in January of last year, offensive lineman Devin Willock and staffer Chandler LaCroix lost their lives in an automotive accident there at Georgia. So, look, Kirby was asked about it all last year at SEC Media Days. He's going to be asked about it again this year. What is going on in Georgia? Why can they not get a hold of this? Now, the kind of funny part of the details, Hughley and Mondon were both released on bonds totaling $26. So my question is, what are we doing here? Look, speeding is never a good thing, reckless driving, but in most states, in most counties, it's a ticket. Here's your ticket, move on with your day. Why are we having to result in arrests? And from what I understand, there's two different things. You had the Athens County Sheriff's Office, and you had campus police involved in one of these other incidences. Like, are we wasting everybody's time bringing these guys in and, on a $26 bond? Like, give them the ticket and move on. Why are we having to put them in handcuffs and process them and all this kind of stuff? The other side of it is, hey, Georgia football players, stop driving recklessly. Like, it's just going to be very interesting to see how this affects the Clemson game. Will Trevor Etienne be suspended for that game? Will he miss any time? Smael Mondon, these guys, at a certain point, Kirby's got to start saying, guys, we're doing everything we can. We're holding seminars. We're preaching to you guys the dangers of reckless driving. Hey, grab an Uber or a Lyft when you have to. Like, it just seems utterly ridiculous. And, again, it grabs headlines because this continues to happen at Georgia. And a lot of people are saying, like, what's the problem? Kirby, you're running a national championship contending program every year. Let's wrangle this in. And for Kirby's sake, maybe he has to start sending a message with some punishment. Hey, Trevor Etienne made a bad decision. You're going to miss 2 games. Again, you don't want to sacrifice the season. I get it, but it seems like you got to start getting super serious here with these guys because message is not being received, it seems like. Etienne, by the way, was allegedly speeding over 80 miles per hour in a 50-mile-per-hour zone and passed a double yellow line when he was arrested on DUI charges. So we shall see what happens over there in Athens and how Kirby addresses it next week in SEC Media Days. All right, over at Auburn, they made a late addition to their 2024 football roster, announcing the signing of Fa'Najae Gotay on Thursday. He's a transfer linebacker from Maryland, entering year 7 of his college football career. He was a Florida high school standout, been in Maryland since 2018, made 4 appearances in his first year, redshirted as a redshirt freshman, played in 9 games that year. In 2020, it didn't count because of COVID and so on and so forth. Last season, he was a regular contributor in year 6 of his career, finished 8th on the team with 44 tackles, 2.5 sacks, and an interception. He did lead the Maryland defense with 6 tackles in the Music City Bowl win over Auburn just this past December. So nice addition there. Nice guy to add to the mix there for the defense for the Auburn Tigers. Meanwhile, over at Georgia, they landed a unique O-lineman prospect from the NBA, who's an NBA draft prospect. Late piece of the 2024 recruiting class this week, Jarzare Jackson, stand out in the Overtime Elite League in Atlanta, 6'11", 330 pounds. He was considering Florida, Florida State, Mississippi State, and others, and he will transition to full-time football. He was a 2-time champion in the OTE League, and now the Bulldogs will get to work with him and tap into his athletic build and see if they can find some offensive line depth out of him. So we'll see what happens with him. In other news, recruiting news, over at South Carolina, they made a big splash for the class of 2025 on Thursday, picking up a commitment from 4-star wide receiver Lex Cyrus. He's a native of Pennsylvania, chose South Carolina over Penn State. So pulling a kid out of Pennsylvania, choosing South Carolina over Penn State. He's the number 250 overall player, the number 32 wideout in the country, and the number 9 player from the state of Pennsylvania. Over at Texas, Arch Manning, reverse course. He will be in the EA Sports college football video game after all. It was previously reported that Arch would not be opting into the video game this year. On Tuesday, EA Sports revealed a short promo video featuring Arch and his uncle Eli to announce he will indeed be in the video game. All players had the opportunity to opt in and get player compensation from EA Sports. According to On3, Manning received an additional NIL package to help promote the game. Manning is set to earn between $50,000 and $60,000 in his agreement with EA Sports. Get you paid, Arch Manning. And lastly, over at LSU, some post-career success for Jayden Daniels. He was named SEC's Male Athlete of the Year on Tuesday. The 2023-24 Roy Kramer Male Athlete of the Year. Parker Valby, star runner for Florida, received the Female Athlete of the Year award. But, of course, Jayden Daniels winning the Heisman Trophy. Was named a consensus All-American, SEC Offensive Player of the Year, Walter Camp Offensive Player of the Year, Davey O'Brien Award, and, of course, went top 5 in the draft this year to the Washington Commanders, number 2 overall. So there you have it. You are all caught up with all the news going on around the conference. Coming up next, we are going to switch gears. We'll talk a little big picture SEC stuff in history of the SEC with Colby Newton. He's got a new book out that we will talk all about as well. More Locked On SEC coming your way after this. Thank you for making Locked On SEC your first listen every day. But first, I want to remind you guys this episode is presented to you by our friends over at eBay Motors. Look, passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, whether it's superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, whatever it is, whether you're in the speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you're always going to find exactly what you're looking for. And with that eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive over at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. It is ebaymotors.com. We're along here, Locked On SEC, and thank you guys for making us your first listen every day. Shout out to everydayers. Keep coming back and checking us out. Of course, we'll be live at SEC Media Days all next week, grabbing some great interviews and some great content. And look, with SEC Media Days happening next week, what better time than to talk with Colby Newton, his new book coming out, SEC Football, How a Regional League Became a National Obsession. If you're listening to this podcast, watching the show on YouTube, you're probably a little bit obsessed with the SEC like we all are. It drops July 16th. You can head on over to Colby's Twitter account at Colt Newton to get 30% off discount code and get pre-sold and all that kind of stuff. Colby, welcome in, man. Appreciate you joining us.
Yeah, I really appreciate you having me on, Chris, and excited to talk about the SEC, and football season's around the corner, so I think we're all itching for it.
So before we get to the book, give us a little background on yourself, because I see the U in the background. You're a Utah guy. How does a Utah guy become obsessed with the SEC like we all are?
Yeah, that's a great question. I am a proud University of Utah graduate and born and raised here in the Salt Lake City area. But honestly, it was kind of the genesis for the book. When I was a kid, the SEC on CBS started to take hold. And how could you not get attached to this passion and pageantry that was going on in this part of the country that I immediately fell in love with? And that I've been an SEC fan for as long as I can remember, and thought, gosh, that'd be really fun to kind of dive into this, maybe even almost from an outsider's perspective, not having been born and raised in the South, but I felt like I could bring it some objectivity and really dive in and find out if there was a story there that could be told.
It's fascinating because it's so funny across the South, everywhere you go, somebody's got an allegiance. You know, either you went to LSU or you grew up in Birmingham, you didn't go to Alabama, but your family's big Alabama fans. Like, everybody's kind of got an allegiance. So I kind of like it that you're kind of, the court has been separated. You don't have an allegiance to just one school. Nobody can accuse you of bias in this book, right? Of, oh, he's just an Auburn grad. He's just going to, talk about how great Auburn is in the SEC. So I kind of like that. And it's a great reason on why you wrote this book.
Yeah, there's no allegiances on my side. I actually touch on a little bit in my author's note at the beginning of where I'm coming from as far as my angle on this book. When I was a little boy, the very first football player I remember was Herschel Walker at Georgia. And really from there, been hooked on the SEC. So when it came to be a national player on CBS, I mean, it was appointment viewing for me. I couldn't miss that game of the week with Vern Lundquist, now Brad Nessler. It's just, there's something magical about it.
It's so funny you mentioned that, because it really is a story of those who grew up in the South and fans of an SEC team or the league. We all remember one player. And it's so funny to hear all the different eras. I mean, you talk to some of the old heads and they remember Archie Manning or Billy Cannon as the first player that they remember watching as a kid. And then, in the later years into the 80s and the 90s, everybody's got that player that they think back on, and that instant memory of brings you back to SEC football and when you first started watching it. But in the book, I mean, you go back to the early days of the foundation of the conference and kind of taking us up today. It's pretty crazy looking back on those early days, though. I mean, we've had so many conferences come and go, Colby, over the years. It's crazy that this thing all kind of came together, about 92 years ago?
Yeah, early 1930s. I'm a huge history guy. I love history and context behind things and trying to understand how things came to be. So I thought it would be important to really spend the first couple of chapters diving back into how did the SEC even come to be? What were those first couple decades like, especially relative to the rest of the college football world? How dominant or on par was the SEC with everybody else, to really kind of lay that foundation for what started to happen in the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s. But there's some fascinating stories in there that I would assume some SEC fans know. I hope I unearthed a few that maybe somebody had forgotten about, but there's some cool things that took place in the 30s and 40s that really helped lay where the SEC has gone to this day.
And I think the timing is kind of funny with the SEC literally just expanding 2 weeks ago with Texas and Oklahoma now official members of the conference. But I think most people remember Texas A&M and Missouri coming in just 12 years ago. But I think some of our listeners, especially our younger podcast listeners and YouTubers, may not even be old enough to remember the days of 1992 when Arkansas and South Carolina joined the league, because for a lot of people, it's just they've always been members. But you go back to the old days of the Southwest Conference and Arkansas being over there, it's kind of cool to renew the rivalry with Texas and some old traditions that are coming back.
Yeah, that's a big part of the book. The conference expansion that Roy Kramer and even Harvey Schiller, the previous commissioner, led those efforts to bring Arkansas and South Carolina into the league. And we go into great depth exploring what happened and how that went down. They wanted a lot of different teams. Texas and Texas A&M were certainly on the radar at that point. It was interesting to go back and see how wide open it was as far as in the media, and people knew about it, knew that the SEC was kind of open for business, as opposed to when Texas and Oklahoma joined. I think that was a little bit more of a shock to a lot of especially the general college football fans out there. But yeah, the league is not where it is without that first expansion. When Arkansas joined all those years ago, it was the very first time a team jumped from one conference to another as far as power to power. You had a lot of independents that had been joining. Penn State joined the Big Ten months before, but they were an independent. And same with South Carolina. They were coming from an independent status. And same with Miami was another hot team, Florida State back then as well. But Arkansas really was that first domino to fall. And there's some great stories we share in the book as far as how that happened. Frank Broyles was the one that really led that effort in meeting with Roy Kramer. They met in a small motel outside of Memphis. At one point, Roy Kramer thought that the press had gotten word of it because there were so many cameras in the hotel. Turns out it was a beauty pageant that was taking place. So there's little things like that, little nuggets that I love to learn about and read about. But yeah, that was a big part of it. And it's interesting that it's happening now again with the expansion that just happened a couple of days ago.
What's so interesting is looking back on it. I mean, I know we're just saying goodbye to the SEC on CBS, and it's now the SEC on ABC, ESPN, and the whole Disney family of networks. But really, the SEC on CBS lended a more national perspective to the league, because I remember watching games, on Jefferson Pilot and then eventually Lincoln Financial. And, it's like the 11 a.m. game, and it's, the graphics are terrible and all this, but like that 2:30 Central, 3:30 Eastern time slot, the official SEC on CBS with the music we all know and associate, like that really opened this thing up more to the large national audience.
The SEC isn't where it is today without that partnership with CBS. And it was really fun to go back and research and kind of relearn what happened leading up to that with the Supreme Court decision that so many people are familiar with. But after that decision came down, revenues actually went down. And there were a lot of people in the college football world that thought we're now too saturated with games on TV and we need to pull back. The SEC was the only league that did not want to pull back. You mentioned that regional syndication package that they had. They also had games on ESPN in the evening. The Big Ten at that time still was content with being regionalized. So it was a lot harder for a national audience to catch Big Ten games. When the SEC signed on with CBS, ABC executives went out into the media and were quoted on the record saying, this is never going to work. There's an ABC executive that said something like, why would somebody in Colorado ever care about Florida playing Tennessee? And how wrong is he looking back on that? Because everybody cares. And I'm a perfect example of that. I grew up in the West. And like you said, that was appointment viewing for me. I cared far more about that SEC on CBS game than some regional game that was being shown with the Pac-10 at the time or the Big Ten. So I firmly believe that was a huge part of what laid the foundation for the conference to dominate with national titles once about the turn of the century hit.
It's crazy to think back in the day. I mean, the networks were like, all right, we got to get done with this football game because we got to get to Heidi. The Disney movie's coming on at 7. We got to get to the movie. And it's like nowadays, push everything back, preempt 60 minutes. We got to get the football game in. So it's just kind of funny, the evolution of it. More with Colby Newton here in just a second here on Locked On SEC. All right, still more to come with Colby Newton here, and still more to come on Locked On SEC, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, covering your team every day. A quick minute here for our friends over at FanDuel. Look, we love sports. You love sports. And look, NBA playoffs have ended. We're into the summer months of Major League Baseball. FanDuel wants you to keep the sports going whenever you want. All you got to do is open up the FanDuel app and dream up any bets that you're in the mood for. And this summer, FanDuel, they are hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Head on over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. And just looking ahead, some of the bets I've been looking at: SEC Conference Championship game winner odds. They are up now there at FanDuel. Georgia is the heavy favorite. They're minus 185 to win the SEC championship game. Texas, you can get them at plus 350. Alabama, plus 700. Ole Miss, plus 750. And how about a long shot? LSU, plus 1,000. A $50 bet on LSU wins you $500. You can do that over at FanDuel.com. They are FanDuel. They are the official betting partner of Major League Baseball. And, of course, tons of Week 1 SEC lines are up there now, and of course more and more odds being added as we get closer to the college football season. Go check it out. It is FanDuel. Check them out today. Continue on here on Locked On SEC, covering the entire conference. Of course, your team every day right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. And Colby Newton is joining us. His new book is on the way out, SEC Football, How a Regional League Became a National Obsession. And you can follow him on Twitter at Colby Newton and get the pre-order there. And the special code that will get you that discount before the book comes out. And like we talked about, perfect timing here with SEC Media Day starting up. And it's going to be very interesting, Colby, with the playoff expansion and everything else. What's going to happen with the future of conference championship games? Because in basketball, they've largely become irrelevant for the most part. I mean, most people are like, we just want to punch our ticket and get to the tournament. We don't care about winning a, meaningless conference championship. But for so many years, the history of the SEC championship game is one that means so much. And it's so interesting to read some of the history you write about this thing. That I know it's in Atlanta now, but man, there were so many different cities that this thing, did I read right? Like Orlando was in the running at one point.
Yeah, Orlando was throwing Mickey Mouse out. Everybody was going to get, all the teams were going to get free passes to Disney. Tampa was heavily involved in it as well. And Birmingham ended up winning the bid for those first 2 years. And it was fun to go back and kind of tell that story. But yeah, the championship game is another big part of what helped set the SEC apart. And again, we look back on that and it seems like such a no-brainer. But really, at the time, nobody wanted it. The coaches in the league didn't want it. There's the famous quote from Gene Stallings. When Roy Kramer told the coaches, he said, no SEC team will ever win another national championship. And coaches outside the league didn't want it. They were threatening to not schedule SEC teams anymore. So that conference title game really became a huge part of the culture of the SEC. And I don't know where it's going to go, Chris, with what's going to happen now. It's always been such a special part of the year for me as a college football fan. And I would hate for that to go away. So I'm hoping it still maintains some relevance because it's so fun to watch year in and year out, but also because it has such historical significance.
Yeah, and it just always seems like Atlanta it's so easy to get to for Bama fans, Auburn fans, even LSU fans. I've had tons of LSU friends who've made the drive overnight, to get to Atlanta for the championship title game. So it always just seems so, I know it's over on the East Coast, but it just always seems so central for the SEC fan bases. And Atlanta's done a great job of hosting it for all these years, and the event gets bigger and bigger. Nick Saban. Nick Saban could have been half this book, honestly. And I know you have multiple different pieces and stories on him, but looking back on it, man, if Atlanta does indeed hire Rich Rodriguez back in 2007, 2008, how different does the SEC look if Nick Saban never comes back to the conference?
Yeah, Saban's a fascinating figure and a lot of what ifs there. I'll even go back one further. What if LSU doesn't hire him? He was not the first choice for LSU. I believe Mark Emmert was the president at the time, and he was not really on anyone's radar and ended up getting a meeting with the LSU brass in Memphis. Again, seems like Memphis has this special place in the back dealings of the SEC. But yeah, Saban takes that job at LSU, changes that program around, wins that national championship, and then comes back to Alabama. And yeah, we go into some pretty great detail with some cool stories about that. If Rich Rod takes that job, or if Saban's successful or more successful with the Dolphins and stays in the NFL, I don't know that the league still would have obviously been very successful, but him combined with Urban Meyer, bringing the level of recruiting up, the level of facilities up, and it was kind of like a rising tide will lift all the boats, and all of a sudden all these other programs were matching it. Yet Auburn winning a national title pretty soon after that as well. So that's a really fun part of the book, and Saban is a huge, huge part of SEC history.
Another guy who, you really can't tell the story of the SEC without including this guy's name, and a guy you probably saw firsthand from his time at Utah, going from Bowling Green to Utah and then eventually to Florida. The head coach, Urban Meyer, who, of course, wins the 2 championships there at Florida. Man, I mean, I know he went on to win the title at Ohio State, and now he's on the Big Ten noon kickoff or whatever, but he really was a big chapter or a big part of the SEC from those early 2000s.
Yeah, Urban came in and really was that challenge, I think, to Nick Saban, where they were able to compete with each other. And one of the funny stories that we unearthed with him when he recruited Tim Tebow was down to Florida and Alabama, and he finally decided on Florida, but he wanted to call Alabama, and it was Shula at the time. So he calls him and tells him no, but he's such an emotional guy that he's crying, and he's so upset because he didn't want to let him down. Well, he tells him, I'm not coming, calls Urban Meyer right after, still emotional. Urban hears him. He's like, oh boy, he's going to tell me he's not coming. And the phone line goes dead. So Urban's left to understand. He's thinking, I don't know what's going on. He can't even watch the announcement. That's how he finds out that Tim Tebow's coming to Florida. Is his family is in the living room shouting, hey, he's coming. And Urban comes running in. So yeah, just a fun story about that. But yeah, Urban is a huge part of the story of the SEC in the recent history as well. And when you look at the national championships that were won by Florida in those early 2000s, such a huge part of what happened.
It's pretty crazy. Now we've also had multiple times with 2 SEC teams playing for a national championship, and it could happen even more now with the expanded playoff. I mean, the odds are likely we're going to end up with 2 SEC teams playing again at some point. But you were down there on the field for one of these games, right? I
was on the sideline in New Orleans for Alabama LSU. It was the game that it seemed like nobody in the country outside the South wanted. I couldn't have been more excited. This is great. I get 2 SEC teams, and I get to stand on the sideline and watch these 2 teams go at it. Obviously, Alabama won that game. But yeah, that could happen again. And it's going to be really interesting to see out of those 12 spots, how many go to the SEC, how many go to the Big Ten. I think you're going to get a lot. I mean, you could, in theory, have a Final 4 of all SEC or 3 of the 4. I don't think that would surprise anybody, which is really what, as a testament to the league now, we are now surprised when the league doesn't win a national championship. If you're as old as I am, and probably you are, Chris, you understand that wasn't always the case. Yep. If you're a 25-year-old college football fan, it's just kind of how it is. And it's going to be fun to see what happens going forward.
Yeah, I was down in Houston for the championship this year, and it was just weird. I mean, nothing against Michigan, worthy champion and all that, but Michigan versus Washington, it's like, can we get something better than this? Like, where's the SEC? They're not represented here. I know you, did I hear this right, that you're pretty familiar with Jackson Dart, right? One of the big time players at Ole Miss. He played a little high school ball there in the Utah area.
He did. He played high school ball at the school that my kids go to here in Draper, Utah, Corner Canyon. It's been really fun to watch him succeed after it maybe didn't work out the way that he thought it was going to at USC. And he's got a great cast around him at Ole Miss this year. And it'll be really interesting to see what happens with Dart and Lane Kiffin and see if Ole Miss can't make a run at a natty.
Yeah, that's
like the John Vaught days.
Yeah, well, I keep saying, the old joke is always don't ask an Ole Miss fan for directions to Atlanta. They don't know. They've never been there. Even with Eli Manning, they never played for an SEC championship. So could be crazy. This might be the year if Lane Kiffin can take that next step. Last thing for you, Colby. And again, the book is SEC Football, How a Regional League Became a National Obsession. Evolution of the conference. 20 years ago, this was a defense-first conference. I remember Nick Saban having that great LSU, defense in 2003. Obviously, Kirby's had some great defenses that Saban has as well, but it feels like the last 5, 6, 7 years, it's offense first. If you can't score 40 points a week, you're taking losses in this league. What do you make of how this has kind of become? 11 of the 16 teams in the SEC are bringing quarterbacks to SEC media days. You really got to have that solid offense now these days.
Yeah, I think that's a bigger picture of college football in general, right? You've got to be able to put points on the board, and gone are the days where you can, it seems like, hold a team to 20 and try and outscore them. If your offense doesn't get the points, you're not going to win. And I think it's going to be fun to see who innovates, because I'll take you back to the mid-'90s with Steve Spurrier, and he was so innovative with his offense in a defense-first league and was able to win championships. Now it's going to be who's going to be able to innovate within the structure of the current like you said, 30 and 40-point wins to put themselves on a different level, especially the teams that maybe are a notch below the Alabamas of the world, the Texases of the world? Are they going to be able to, innovate to differentiate themselves?
One more time, the book is called SEC Football: How a Regional League Became a National Obsession, and you can find it on Amazon or go to Colby's Twitter account @ColbNewton. You can find it there, and he's got the link. You can pre-order the book. Got a promo code up there for you can get the book 30% off before it comes out. Again, comes out July 16th, coming up this next week. Colby, really appreciate the time, man. I'm a couple chapters into the book. Can't wait to finish reading it, and going to read it on the plane over to SEC Media Days. But really appreciate you taking the time, man, and we'll have to do this again real soon.
Yeah, I love being on, Chris. Appreciate you, and excited to see what happens with the book and with the season.
Yeah, absolutely. It's craziness. NIL and everything else changing the landscape day by day in college football, but we'll see what happens. Colby, thanks for the time, man. All right. Thank you guys for checking us out today and making Locked On SEC your first listen every day. Thanks to Colby Newton, and shout out to our everydayers coming back and checking us out each and every day. All next week, guys, we will be live from SEC Media Days, getting you caught up with some great interviews and guests and content from over there in Dallas. So make sure you're checking us out. And hey, for your second listen, we talked a little bit about Alabama today and Nick Saban, the history. Check out our friends over at Locked On Bama. Luke Robinson doing a tremendous job keeping you up to date on all the latest news with the Alabama Crimson Tide. Again, Locked On Bama, wherever you get your podcasts, on YouTube. And of course, you can find our Locked On Sports Today podcast over there on the Free Fire TV channels app as well. I'm Chris Gordy. This has been Locked On SEC. You guys have a great weekend. We'll talk to you next week from SEC Media Days.